last speaker, Dr. Anna Maher, is with the USDA Northwest Climate Hub in Portland.
Ecosystem services from rangelands and pastures in the Northwest have an estimated annual value of more than 1.2 billion US dollars. These services include sage grouse habitat, water filtration, and carbon sequestration. Rangelands also help to support the agricultural industry in the Northwest. For example, approximately 29,000 beef cattle ranches and farms generate 1.7 billion US dollars in gross revenue annually, and majority of this is from cattle and calf sales. Today, I'll be presenting portions of a literature synthesis of climate change impacts on rangelands and rangeland management. My position is supported by the Northwest Climate Hub. The Northwest Climate Hub serves Alaska as well, but for this synthesis, I'm focusing on Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, which are the 3 US states in the bottom left-hand corner of the map. Rangelands are indicated in yellow in this diagram. They are a prevalent land type in the Western United States. On the left, we can see the Northwest area is a mix of forest, shown in green, and also rangeland, shown in yellow. Much of these rangelands are shrublands such as sagebrush steppe. Rangeland resources are a critical component of the Northwest economy and also support rangeland livelihoods and communities, cultural values, and traditions. In addition, many wildlife species, including the iconic greater sage grouse, depend upon vast, relatively unfragmented expanses of rangeland for their survival. Rangelands are also an important grazing resource in this region to produce livestock. Cattle production specifically utilizes an estimated total of 47 million acres in the Northwest, and approximately 77% of these acres are publicly owned. Understanding climate change related impacts can help us better prepare these important rangelands for the future. Recent droughts and wildfires provide insight into the types of climate impacts that we are expected to see, as well as what we need to do to prepare. Current science indicates that the 2015 drought in the Northwest was indicative of future climate conditions. Impacts from this snow drought included reduced irrigation water, increased heat stress impacts on livestock and also forage impacts, increased fish mortality due to low flows in streams and rivers, and finally, drought-related wildfires burned more than 1 million acres in the Northwest, with impacted areas including sage grouse habitat and numerous grazing allotments. Just this last year, conditions in spring 2021 contributed to the dry conditions later in the year. This map from the US Drought Monitor shows what current conditions were in August. The 2021 drought was the second driest March to August in a 127-year record. Portions of the Northwest also experienced the hottest June and July on record. With future climate change, it is projected that the Northwest will experience longer, dry periods during the summer, indicating that we can learn some from these impacts that occurred. Some of the drought impacts that occurred in 2021 include, towards the end of the summer, 50% or more of pasture and rangelands in the Northwest were considered in poor to very poor condition. Early sell-off of cattle occurred. Also, widespread fish mortality occurred, and more than 1 million acres burned in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. We think of these as drought-related wildfires because drought causes vegetation to dry out and become more flammable, leading to wildland fires. Indeed, area burned is expected to increase with temperature increases from climate change. For example, this is an estimate of the increase in area burned with a 1 degree increase in temperature. In the center of the screen, areas in yellow indicate a doubling or tripling of burn area. And we can note that the forested areas surrounding that yellow area show much greater increases in projected area burned with increasing temperature. Decreasing snowpack is an important climate change concern in the Northwest, especially during the summer months. In this diagram, the red circles show declines in snowpack. And we can see they're already occurring in many areas of the Northwest. This may exacerbate water and vegetation concerns during drought. Periods of prolonged drought interspersed with years of heavy rainfall are expected to persist in this region. Higher evapotranspiration rates are expected as well with increasing temperatures. Snowpack in this area acts as a natural reservoir that is important to summer irrigation, rangeland vegetation, and summer stream flows. Water changes limit net primary productivity and reduce grazing water sources during the summer months. Distance from water is an important limiting factor on cattle grazing distribution, and climate change is also likely to intensify issues regarding grazing in riparian areas. It is expected that water systems and water developments will need to be expanded to maintain or improve cattle distribution and to secure additional forage and feed resources. There may be opportunities for supplemental forage and feed resources during dry times in the Northwest, but we have to keep in mind competing water needs, including other agriculture, hydroelectric power generation, and protection of fish habitat. Also, areas where water is already fully allocated according to average conditions may be particularly vulnerable. I'm showing here an example of management challenges in the Northwest using the state of Oregon as an example. The areas outlined in black are counties where sage grouse are present. The dashed red areas are critical habitat for sage grouse, or what are often referred to as priority areas of conservation. This map also shows the current predicted burn probability for a large fire that is defined here as greater than 250 acres. And the highest probabilities are shown in the dark orange. We can see that these orange areas coincide with many of these high priority areas for conservation. Also, using this planning tool, I saw that these higher burn probabilities in Eastern Oregon closely mirror the extent of high annual grass and annual forb cover in the area. This helps us to understand that climate impacts are coming into a world of existing management challenges in the Northwest, including changed fire regimes, for example, related to increased fuel loads from past management. Other challenges include problems with native perennial plant establishment after fire and sage grouse conservation. Sage grouse depend upon sagebrush for all stages of their life cycle. And also, many of us are familiar with the impacts of invasive annual grass fire cycles, the most famous one being cheatgrass. Climate change is expected to exacerbate this problem not only through an increased risk of fire, but also through decreased resilience of native perennials. Cheatgrass is known for its continuous and fine fuel loads, flammable earlier in the summer as it senesces earlier, and exhibits high interannual variability in response to variable precipitation, and does well with more frequent fire. In summary, we're expecting increased frequency and severity of droughts and subsequent wildfires, also changing forage and water resources over space and time due to reduced snowpack and other factors, including earlier senescence of many species, leading to diminished late season forage supplies. And finally, several compounding and interacting ecological and social impacts and drivers of change are expected. Climate change adaptation practices can help by proactively reducing impacts expected from extreme events. Preparing for extreme disturbance in particular may be helpful. Sometimes large and severe fires, for example, come through and land managers have to spend a great deal of time or other resources restoring vegetation and also rebuilding infrastructure. Fire is a natural part of these systems. However, a fire that has long-lasting negative impacts on the soils and vegetation and affect the ability for the vegetation to recover is a problem for many reasons, including high costs and low effectiveness of restoration. Also, recovery and restoration in these cases may take away resources needed to prepare for disturbances in the future. This provides a sense of urgency and preparation so that we can avoid getting stuck reacting to urgent situations in the moment at the expense of being able to plan ahead and create more resilient systems. Wildfire and drought preparation are important opportunities. Here I'll review some climate adaptation strategies, starting with fire. The climate adaptation approach here is to ensure that plant communities can be resilient to periodic fire. For example, fire in some sagebrush communities can wipe out sagebrush vegetation over large areas and precipitate huge increases in invasive annual grasses. This may increase the likelihood of reburns and/or additional annual grass establishment. Pre-fire methods to reduce potential severity could be critical for resiliency of these systems and for maintaining sage-grouse habitat. One example strategy I have listed here is to minimize fire severity prior to invasive annual grass dominance. Some example practices include planning and preparing for a greater burn area. This can include managing for large areas to promote defendable fire breaks and fuel reduction strategies. Also considering, and a second example is considering fuel treatments, especially after high production years in some sagebrush communities, and anticipating impending drought and subsequent wildfire risks is important as well. Another area for preparation in this area is for drought. The overall adaptation approach given here is water, soil, and soil water retention. An example strategy is to retain soil moisture for native shrubs, forbs, and grasses. And the example practice given is to manage juniper expansion. And we know that conifer expansion has been talked about in other talks into rangeland. It has been an important issue in this area for the last 100 years or more, but is increasingly problematic in the presence of extreme droughts, increasing evaporative demand due to increasing temperatures, and also reduced seasonal soil moisture as a result of reduced snowpack. One study of Central Oregon that modeled projected climate change impacts found that juniper treatments in cool, moist sagebrush steppe substantially reduce the rate of juniper encroachment, particularly when prioritized early in the century. A little more about drought preparation. Same adaptation approach with another example strategy to retain and improve perennial vegetation and healthy soils to improve water holding capacity. Maintaining or some example practices are maintaining or increasing soil organic matter and plant vigor and diversity. For example, planting climate adapted native grasses as a preventive measure in areas of concern for invasive annual grasses may be feasible primarily on smaller scales like private lands, if not cost prohibitive. A second example is to plan and invest to manage distribution, timing, intensity, and duration of grazing, which comes up a lot in the literature. However, it likely requires investment in things like infrastructure and/or labor. So for example, fencing and/or virtual fencing or range riders, water tanks, piping systems, and upland vegetation monitoring, as well as on public lands, considering longer-term planning for things like investment in water tanks. The NEPA process for water tanks, for example, can take 3 to 5 years. Investments in upland water tanks, however, may also help to reduce time cattle spend in riparian areas by providing additional water sources and may potentially reduce drought impacts on livestock production and other ungulates. Climate change adaptation does not mean that common ecosystem management practices are no longer appropriate. Rather, the prioritization and spatial extent of those practices will likely change in anticipation of climate impacts. For example, managers may shift more of their resources towards better preparation for wildfire or drought in areas with lower levels of exotic annual grass invasion. In conclusion, rangeland management issues in the Northwest are growing and becoming increasingly complex with interacting factors such as drought, fire, and invasive annual grass species. There's an increased sense of urgency and also opportunity for management under climate change, as degradation cycles are likely to happen more frequently and potentially at faster rates. As we just discussed, there are actions land managers can take to prepare. There are also important practices for disturbance response and restoration, which will be presented in this synthesis paper. I also didn't have time to discuss this connect piece, which refers to connections and is shown at the bottom of the diagram, as this can create the foundation for climate adaptation. This means connecting with different knowledge sources, community organizations, and collaboratives, establishing long-term science management partnerships, and so on. For example, there is a growing recognition of the contribution that local, indigenous, and/or professional knowledge contribute to scientific knowledge and natural resource management. The ability to connect can inform and support the where, the when, and the how of these climate adaptation practices. Also, connecting through collaborative efforts have benefits beyond knowledge sharing, including trust building, increasing collaborative capacity, and increasing the pace of learning. Better, more informed and inclusive climate adaptation prioritization through these connections I just described are also critical to striking a balance. By balance, I mean a balance between adaptive responses and planning ahead using climate change information. Also a balance between flexibility and accountability. Flexibility has been talked about a bit here today. It is so important with fluctuating forage production and greater uncertainty with sudden drought or wildfire. However, attaining flexibility can be difficult, especially on public lands, and establishing the necessary level of accountability is key. There are some important management examples of accountable and flexible approaches that I touch on in this synthesis. In preparing for extreme drought and wildfire or other climate change impacts, the rangeland community may very well find great commonality in goals, opportunities for the coordination of resources, and alignment of values. My hope is that by focusing more on preparation and connections, the rangeland community can also come together to respond most effectively during extreme disturbance, as well as restore and prepare again after the fire has gone out and the rain has come back. Thank you for taking the time to learn with me today. I'd like to thank my co-authors, as well as many others that have provided their support and guidance on this project. Happy to answer any questions. I also have some great resources for anyone who is interested, and have included a few of them here, which I will just flash briefly on the screen, but I'm happy to connect more.